but not least for the Carnegie Council, there are many ethical considerations. What do I mean by that? Well, one of the most prominent ethical issues at the very center of the climate change conversation is equity. The countries who have done least to cause climate change are the ones who are suffering the most from its effects. That has been with us from day one in terms of looking at how the conversation on global climate change has played out in the international community. We saw in Glasgow that issue is far from resolved. In fact, there is increasing anger on the part of developing countries that equity is not being addressed. Equity in finance, equity in terms of compensation, loss and damage, and equity in terms of who cuts emissions and how much and who goes first. That issue is also at the center of thinking about some of these new techniques. So for example, who's deciding if this technique might be used? Are the most vulnerable, the most climate impacted countries sitting at that table helping make that decision? Whose data are they using? Who has the authority and who has the legitimacy globally to be making these decisions? That, in part, is an important reason why, as Janos mentioned, that we are looking to the UN General Assembly for the first truly international discussion of this technique in its broadest impact. The UN General Assembly is the world's most representative body. It is considered, therefore, the most legitimate body, and we feel that the discussion on a technique that affects every single country in the world, for better or for worse, needs to at least start in the world's most representative body. And there, whatever the GA decides to do is their business. But that's why we have focused on the UN General Assembly as that starting point. There are also issues of intergenerational equity. Without getting into too much of the detail, once one starts this technique, it is very hard to stop. If one stops suddenly, there is what I call a boomerang or a termination effect, whereby the temperature that has artificially been lowered then rises back to its previous level. And that variation in temperature would be devastating for biodiversity. We simply can't adapt species, flora, fauna in that short of a time to that great of a temperature change. So one would have to wean off this technology very carefully over time. What that means is, if we start, we're effectively locking in a certain pathway for the future. Now, of course, one can also argue in our current pathway, what we're doing right now, heading to 2 to 3 degrees centigrade, is also locking in a future. So as Janos said, one has to look at this in the context of what are we doing right now, and what might be the implications of doing something differently using techniques that are still being researched, but there are a great many unknowns involved with them. And then lastly, there's a question of legitimacy. Does humanity actually have the right to deliberately change the climate? Of course, we are changing the climate right now. That's why we have the problem of climate change. But it is not intentional. It is an after effect, a consequence of a fossil fuel economy. These techniques would be deliberately trying to engineer the climate. Is that just human hubris on steroids? Do we really think we have the knowledge, the wisdom to be able to do that, and to do it not in a one-time manner, but over many, many decades? Are we just playing God, as some people say? Do we have the legitimacy, the right as a species to actually try to alter the climate? So these questions are swirling around some of the harder science questions, the geopolitical questions, but they are very much at the center of the discussion about these techniques.